welcome to Navigating the New Normal. My name is Ali Martin and I'm part of the team at Soul Survivor Watford Church, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Dr. Kate Middleton. Lots of you will know Dr. Kate because over the last few years she's joined us on a fairly regular basis. We've met in our warehouse talking about issues like anxiety and sleep and anger. And right at the beginning of lockdown, Kate and I did a Zoom where we talked about lockdown life and this crazy thing that had just happened to us all. And I'm delighted now, sort of 4 months on, to have Kate back with us to talk about this season. For those of you that don't know Kate though, Kate, why don't you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you. Why are we sat here having this conversation?
Yeah, so I am a psychologist by background. I'm a church leader, not too far away from you guys here. That's why we've met so many times, which has been fantastic. I'm also the director of a national organisation called the Mind and Soul Foundation, which is mindandsoulfoundation.org if you want to check out our website for resources and information. And obviously we have been really busy throughout lockdown just supporting people's well-being and helping them get through this season.
Brilliant. And yeah, in that conversation we had those weeks ago about lockdown life, there was just some brilliant pearls of wisdom there. If you haven't already watched it, you could pause it and go and watch it now, or come back to it another time. That's available on the same YouTube channel. But now we're in a very, very different season. And lots of us are finding it even more hard, funnily enough, than we did 4 months ago. Relationally, there's all kinds of stresses. There's 1,000,001 other stresses. Kate, I'm going to hand over to you now, and you can help us then navigate the new normal. How are we going to do this season well?
Yeah, so let's just take some time to ponder it. What I want to do is just talk a little bit, much like I did 3 months ago, about what this season is about, and really just share some thoughts and some tips for how to navigate the new normal. How do we do this season well? And you'll remember 3 months ago I talked about, is it possible to not just survive but thrive? And in particular, that's the question as we hit not just an acutely stressful, difficult moment, but facing what could be a new normal, a new way of living. And as we look ahead into autumn and so much uncertainty and question, what we need to do is think about how do we do this well for ourselves, but also for the people that we support, for those we love, for those we care for, and for our wider communities. And really in this moment, what we have is the challenge of we're in an in-between, because we're dealing with three things. We're dealing with the right now, but we're also dealing with what may or may not be coming. But also importantly, before we move on, I want to think a little bit about what on earth just happened. Because that actually is a lot of what your brain is trying to do right now. And many of us are coming out of a season that was really quite stressful, quite busy, quite difficult. And particularly, hopefully as we go into August, managing to grab a little bit more time, a little bit more rest. Term has ended, maybe you've got some vacation time booked. And you're trying to catch your breath. And your brain, meanwhile, is saying, seriously, there's some stuff here that you need to think about, some stuff that you need to address, because some of the things that have just happened have challenged the most basic assumptions that we have in our mind about the way that life works, the beliefs that we have about the world, our communities, our relationships, even ourselves, the most basic things that we live by. It's like the fabric and foundation that we've built our life upon, and some of those things have become questioned. So some of the issues around things like our security, the reliability of some of the things in our lives, our own vulnerability, as I say, relationships, the predictability of life. I mean, in a world where A-levels can be cancelled almost overnight, can you rely upon anything? And I think it's important that we realize the degree of work that some of those things are for your brain, just needing to sit back and think, what does this mean? Going forward, does it change the way that I do things like relationships, the way I approach my job, the way I look after my family? And a lot of that is actually quite hard work for your mind, but it also requires some headspace. And in this season, if we don't recognize why we're feeling what we're feeling, then what happens is that we risk adding some extra distress and difficulty to some of the inevitable challenge that we've got already. And there's two things really that therefore we don't actually have to deal with right now that hopefully maybe we can reduce a bit, and that's guilt and fear. And guilt is really important, because if we don't understand why we're feeling, what we can do is feel guilty, particularly in a season where we're going back to normal, where maybe things are getting better. And actually, an awful lot of people who I'm speaking to are finding that they're not feeling a lot better. In fact, they're finding things really hard. And the risk then is that guilt comes in. You just think, what's wrong with me? I'm being ungrateful. If I was a better person, I'd be handling this better. We look at social media and we think everybody else is dealing with this better than me. What's wrong with me? And actually, that's not true. Social media is just everybody else's best moment. You don't see all of the other stuff for them, just like you maybe post your best moments on social media. But we need to understand why this is hard for ourselves and give ourselves space to deal with it. And then fear as well, because we can become afraid. A lot of people are saying to me, have I changed? Is there something wrong with me? Have I now developed a mental health problem? I'm struggling with anxiety and I've never had that before. Is this the rest of my life? Has something changed? And so much of what we're feeling now, it's ordinary human reactions to an extraordinary event that's just happened. It really is unprecedented. We are going through something that as human beings, nobody's been through before. We are facing challenges that our culture and communities haven't faced before. And a lot of the emotional responses we're having are normal, they're to be expected. It doesn't make them easy, but we can expect them, and we don't need to feel afraid of them. We just need to think about how we're going to manage them. So what I want to talk about really is 3 things, therefore, just like I did last time, thinking about 3 things that we can do as we face this new season that will help us to get through it as well as possible. And the first one, particularly for the now of where we are right now, as we go into August, I know that the autumn is coming, and I know you turn on the news, it's like there's 2 different versions of what's coming next. And it's like, choose your reality. Which do you prefer? Is everything going to be normal by Christmas, or are we all doomed? I know which I prefer, but I know all of that is coming. But just right now in August, if at all possible, my number 1 piece of advice to you today is this: stop. If you possibly can, stop, do. Get some rest. Physically get some rest, particularly those of you who have been flat out through this last season. I know some people have been furloughed. You've spent 3 months doing your garden or embroidery or making sourdough or whatever it is you've been doing. But I know a lot of people watching that's not been your experience, and you are exhausted. If you are a school teacher, you've been frontline in the NHS, you've been doing deliveries, you're working in a supermarket, you've been homeschooling your kids, whatever it is that you've been doing. Even for some of you, the exhaustion of boredom, of having lost your productivity, the exhaustion of isolation, being with your own thoughts day in, day out, trying to figure out a way to get through the season, that is exhausting and tiring. You need to get some rest. And in the last session, we talked a lot about the impact of stress and how it's raised our baseline level, so we're all on the edge of overwhelm all the time. And the problem with living in this state of constant high alert when you are exhausted and when you're dealing with all that extra stress is that it does change the way that you think. It changes the way that you act and react to the world around you. And there's 3 key ways that you'll see that affecting you in this season. And it is literally because when you're in that high alert phase, your brain goes onto a kind of emergency system. It's a bit like when the lighting goes down onto emergency lighting. You know when you're on a plane and it's landing at night and they turn off all the lights except the really essential ones. It's a bit like that. Your brain goes onto this sort of emergency system. And so your thinking changes, and it literally turns down your ability to problem solve, to rationalize, to do the detail and complexity of life. And it reduces the world around you and tries to simplify it. And it becomes much more binary. So the first way that your thinking changes is that you see things as either one thing or the other, much more than is the reality. So things are either good or they're bad. Life is either success or failure. You have either succeeded or you've failed. Someone is either for you or against you. And we start to see the world in those categories as though it were that simple. And the problem is it isn't. Most things are much more grey. But it doesn't feel like that. So some of these conversations that we're having with friends and family about how do we do things, and we're saying, well, I think that we should go swimming on Saturday, and someone else who says, gosh, I'm surprised you're thinking about doing that. And all they mean is genuinely they're interested, they're just a bit surprised, gosh, that wasn't their perspective. But to you, that feels like conflict, that feels like criticism. They have become against you because your brain is hypersensitive, it's looking for threat, and it's become too simplified in the way that it's seeing the world around you. So before you know it, you're having a row. And that hypersensitivity is number 2. So it is, like I said last time, like when you're lying awake at night and you hear a noise and it sounds like maybe someone's trying to break into your house, and suddenly you can hear every other noise that you would never normally notice. And it's a bit like this in this season, because we have been in a time when there's so much that's unusual, so much that's different, so much that's changed. But also because we're perceiving risk everywhere. Your brain becomes too sensitive when it's looking for threat or for something that might be a sign that something bad is about to happen. So we're twitchy, we're reactive, our anxiety is more easily triggered than normal. Your brain is looking for problems. And so you're going to find them in places where they're actually not there. And so that is a problem, and we'll talk in a little bit about anxiety. It's a problem just in everyday life. So you're walking down the street and you see someone coming the other day with a mask on. That's going to trigger you an anxiety peak, even though you know in your rational mind, everybody's wearing them now. But because of how your brain is reacting to the circumstances right now, it will trigger that and warn you that that's a potential threat. Or in our conversations when we're picking up conflict where there isn't conflict. And the problem is in those moments is you don't think, aha, here I am, Kate Middleton. What I'm doing here is I'm perceiving this innocent comment from my husband as though he was attacking me when he actually isn't. You just feel like you're being criticized, and therefore you react, you're prickly, and therefore what you're dealing with is a lot more conflict, a lot more difficulty. And I'm hearing a lot about that, both in terms of people's personal relationships, but also in work scenarios, in community scenarios, and of course with our teenagers and young people as well, in their friendships and their relationships, where they're having to deal with these sorts of things as well, without our, hopefully, adult ability to understand things a bit better. So we have to remember that. The third thing that we need to be aware of about the way that your brain might be dealing with things that's different to the way that you normally do, because of the level of threat and stress that you've been under, is that you still will probably be experiencing some differences with your normal processing. So things like memory and attention, your ability to focus. Do you remember the days when you could sit down and just focus your attention on one thing, like just your work? Some of you, that's not been an issue because, like I say, maybe you've been furloughed. Actually, your problem has been not having enough things to do. Many of us, our stress levels have been so high, and we've been juggling so many difficult things that actually the ability to do that has been really hard. And when your stress level is heightened, when your brain is constantly scanning the horizon for the next threat, inevitably you become less good at focusing your attention on one thing because your brain is constantly alerting you to things that are happening on the periphery. Your memory gets less good, so your ability just to hold things in your mind. And many of us will have those moments where you've gone upstairs to get something and then you can't remember what you've gone for, or you've gone into the supermarket and then you suddenly can't remember what you've got. But actually in this moment, those things may be more difficult than normal. And I just want to say to you, don't panic. A lot of that is the level of exhaustion and stress that you're dealing with. And we are all in the same boat there. Everybody is having similar experiences with that stuff. And the thing is that this is exhaustion. We talked last time about one of the big challenges about living on high alert is that sleep becomes a lot more difficult. So it's this terrible double whammy. The demand of day-to-day life has risen, but you cannot rest properly. You can't sleep. You can't switch off. And therefore, so many of us are so exhausted at the end of a 3-month season. And that's why whatever is coming next, probably the most valuable thing you can do right now is find out a way to get some rest, to re-energize, to refuel, to drop your stress levels somehow, to deal with the exhaustion that you're managing. Because actually, otherwise, you might end up worrying and fretting about things that are all just related to that. And if you could just get some rest, a lot of those things would resolve on their own anyway. So we need to do 3 things with some of the sorts of things that I've talked about. We need to recognize the way that this season has had an impact on us. And we need to not be fooled by it. As we recognize it, we need to not be fooled by it, and we don't want it to freak us out. So when we recognize it, what we do is we say, this is okay. We don't let it panic us. We don't let it make us feel guilty. And then the third thing is that we can manage how we deal with those things. So recognizing that there's some things we're not going to be as good at as normal, we can say that's okay. How can we manage those things? How can we get through this season well in spite of those challenges? So getting rest, getting some relaxation, I know what you're all thinking, you're like, it's all very well saying that. How? How on earth do we do that? So there's two main areas that I want to think about in that. And the first one is in the immediate, in the moments where we can snatch little moments. What can you do that takes maybe only minutes but could drop your physiological stress level? One of the things we know about how people respond to seasons of heightened stress is that yes, if they can build things into their weekly and monthly and longer term rhythms that manage it, that's good. But the little things in your daily pattern make a difference too. So the little decisions you make about, shall I just push on into the next stressful thing, or shall I actually just take my cup of tea and sit on the back step for a minute and just have a 5-minute breather? Those little moments can drop our stress level. They help us sustain our energy. They help you to just reduce your alert level very slightly, and they can help you to get through. So where you can grab even just a couple of minutes, do. Where you can put boundaries in, do. So whether you can put boundaries around things like your workspace, your home space, some of the things that have become so blurred that we've talked about. Some people are back in work, back to more of a normal pattern, but many of us are still living that very grey life where everything is in the same 4 walls. So if you're still in that space, just like we talked about 3 months ago, if you can put some boundaries in, do. One thing I would really stress at the moment is putting boundaries around your consumption of media, of news. Gosh, it's so tempting when things are so uncertain. I'm going to turn on the news. I'm going to listen to the next report. I'm going to read the next newspaper article that tells me, yes, definitively, this is what's going to happen. But actually, nobody knows. And we do need to remember that the job of media people is to fill airwave time. And right now, with so much speculation and uncertainty, it's a great time for them to do that. But an awful lot of the drama and the panic that you'll hear about today will have changed by tomorrow. So I think if you can set some good boundaries around how you do and don't consume that, then you'll manage it much better. So if you do want to keep up with the news, and many of us do, maybe think about, is there one program that you listen to once a day, or is there one time that you sit and read the news? Try and avoid having it on in the background or picking up lots of different sources of information. Be particularly careful with less reliable sources of information. So I know it's tempting to read the latest thing that's being circulated on Facebook or on Insta or whatever the social media space is that you use. But the risk with that is that you're going to just be triggering your anxiety level again and again and again. And that just adds to your tiredness, it adds to your exhaustion, and it stops you being able to get away, get a break, and get some rest. So that's short term. Longer term, of course, what we're talking about is thinking about your rhythm and routine. What can you do to get some rest? And really the single most useful thing that I could say to you now is, if at all possible, if you can get a break, do. If you can take a summer holiday, do. Maybe you can't take your usual 2 weeks off, particularly if you're frontline. I know that's something that I'm not able to do as I normally would this August. But where you can get some time out, take it and boundary it as well as you can. Turn off your phone, stop picking up your email. Don't read the news if you don't have to. Even if it's only 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever it is that you can do, guard that time really well, because the more you can get some proper downtime, the better and the more efficiently you'll refuel, re-energize. And that is what's going to sustain you through whatever comes next. So think about that. If you can't get a longer period away, take several shorter periods, even if you just go away for a day, or go out into the country and walk somewhere, getting out of your context, getting away from your town, maybe even getting away from your family. If that's something that might help you, do that. Those moments can be so, so valuable. So get a break. Honestly, if you're sitting watching this and you're thinking, no, I'm sorry, Kate, I'm just too busy to do that, that's why you need to do it. You are too busy not to take a break. You're thinking, no, I can't do that. Too many people rely on me. That's why you need to do it. Too many people rely on you for you to not take a break. The biggest risk in this season is that some of us will think that we're superhuman. We will think we can just keep going, keep pushing it, keep ourselves breaking the limits, breaking the rules like we have been. And the trouble is we do all have limits. We are all human. And there is a very real risk that if we don't take a break now, then come the autumn, we will discover that actually we can't push on through. It's like whipping a horse. You might still be able to run and surprise yourself with what you can keep doing, but you won't be able to keep doing that forever. And this is a new normal. It's a new way of living. So we've got to think about sustainability in this season. So that's my number one, get some rest. Number two is about reconnecting with yourself. Remember that, yourself? Someone said to me the other day when we went out for a coffee, so exciting, in an actual coffee shop sitting outside. It was wild. But they said, Kate, how are you? And I stopped and I said, I have absolutely no idea. And I realised just in the busyness and the craziness and the drama of this last season, it's so long since I stopped and connected with myself. How are you doing? Last time when Ali and I talked, we talked about 3 big emotions that are a challenge or were a challenge through lockdown. And they're still a challenge now, but I think this is a good season to just pause. Some of us need to find some spaces to do that and ask ourselves, how are we feeling? Is there some stuff here that we need to process? We need to admit that it's there. It might not be convenient, it might not be pleasant, but we need to do some work to understand what we're feeling and what we're experiencing. The job of your emotions is to get your attention. So if you don't give them headspace, they will keep growing until eventually you're forced to give them headspace. It's much better to do that proactively before they become a big problem. So let's just think a little bit about those 3 emotions again. And the first one was loss. And in this season, I think many people are only just starting to recognize that they have loss that they need to process, but only just starting to deal with it. And you know, for some of you watching, your loss will be obvious, and some people watching will have experienced the loss of bereavement, and I'm so sorry that this awful virus has hit you in that most brutal of ways. And that loss is obvious, it's painful, it's devastating, it's obvious. And we know that for some people, the processing of that has been interrupted because the normal rituals, the normal events, the funerals, even the simple things like being able to hug people, to weep and lament, those things haven't been as possible as normal. So you might need to create some space and think about how do you do that in this season where you can now maybe meet with more people. You can't hug them, but at least you can sit opposite them and talk. Do you need to make yourself some space with some of your nearest and dearest friends or family to process and deal with some of that loss? But what about those of us who are dealing with loss that is less obvious, the more subtle types of loss that we might have experienced, the loss of productivity, the loss of a season of life, the loss of significant moments in life, even for some of our young people, the loss of something that they kind of think they should be glad about. They didn't have to sit their exams, but weirdly, that is a loss. There are some difficult things that we have to process here. The way that this season has changed and damaged some of our friendships, our relationships, some of the things that we would have taken for granted before. We need to process some of that, and we need to give ourselves time to connect with what we're feeling so that we can understand why we're feeling so emotional. Someone said to me the other day that they met up with a friend they hadn't seen for 3 months and they expected to be so happy. But when they saw that person across the field where they were going to sit and have their distance picnic, what they felt was 2 things. They felt anger and they felt really upset. And in that moment, it was almost terrifying because they think, why? This is not what I should be feeling now. This was supposed to be a joyful moment. It's so inconvenient. It's so difficult. This is not what I should be feeling. But many of us need to accept that this season has had a difficult impact on some of our friendships, some of our relationships, some of our circumstances. And there's loss associated in that. We need to connect with ourselves. And we need to find space to do 2 things. We need to process what on earth has happened. Why are we feeling what we're feeling? So often when feelings are inconvenient, we just try not to feel them, to push them down. Maybe if I just ignore them, they'll go away. But they don't. Like I said, their job is to get your attention. Your brain needs you to think this through. So we need to sometimes face up to the difficult things that we're feeling and figure out why. Let our minds do the literal restructuring, the what does this mean of this moment and of what's just come. That requires time. It requires energy. It requires effort. Sometimes it requires conversation, great people who will help us to do that. Sometimes it requires even a therapeutic space to do that really well. What do you need to do to process what you're feeling right now? And then number 2 is expressing what we need to express. And again, we so want to do the positivity thing. We want to push on through and be cheerful and have our blitz spirit about this. But actually now, for some of us, this is a moment where we need to pause and say, do you know what? This has been really rubbish. This is really hard. Some of you need the space and to be told that it's okay to say this is really hard, that actually I'm grieving something here. I've been alone in my house for 3 months and that's been really difficult. And I'm facing potentially longer season of being alone and that's hard. We need to give ourselves space to express what we're feeling. Remember, crying is oddly important. Often, especially in our British culture, we're not terribly expressive with emotions, but emotions are important. They have a purpose. Did you know when you weep, your tears contain, if they're tears of distress, they contain higher levels of stress hormones than if you're weeping through, I don't know, chopping onions or something else. There's something about weeping that is part of our dealing with a stressful and distressing experience. We might not totally understand why, but that expression of what we're feeling is actually really important. And you know what? In this season, everybody's reaction is different. So you're not going to feel the same thing as the person next to you. Even someone in your household, even someone in your workplace, even someone whose circumstances feel like they're the same as yours, they might be experiencing this in a totally different way. Try not to fight what you're feeling. It's like surfing. If you fight the waves, you're just going to take a dive. What you need to do is try and ride them. Instead of fighting what you're feeling, go with it and try and think, why am I feeling what am I feeling? Give yourself space to express it. Try and understand it better. So that's all about loss. Of course, anxiety is another hugely complex emotion that we're all experiencing in this season that we talked about. And you know, this is a boom season for anxiety, and it's because of something that as psychologists we call dissonance. And dissonance is when there's a mismatch between two things in the present moment. And this is everywhere right now. Because you know what, we talk about normal, and in some ways life feels really normal. So I can leave my house, I can head down into town, I can buy a coffee, I can get a newspaper, I can go shopping. It's very normal. But then do you know what? It isn't normal. Everybody is wearing face masks. I have to queue for 40 minutes to get into my local supermarket. Some of the shops are shut. It is not normal. And that dissonance is something that we're carrying with us all the time. The new normal that isn't normal. Those things that, as I've already said, will spike anxiety for us as your brain tries to get used to so many things that have changed. We are all going to experience more anxiety than normal in this season. And what we need to learn to do is how to hold it, how to manage it. Because over time, as your brain gets used to some of those things, those triggers will settle. It's like your smoke alarm going off every time you put toast on. That's where we all are right now. As your brain gets used to this new way of living, you won't have to deal with so many anxiety spikes. But right now, that is going to be part of this season. Remember, if you can drop your overall stress baseline, you'll manage anxiety better because they operate on the same physiological system. So if your stress level is already up to your overwhelm point, and then you get a little spike of anxiety, it's going to push you into a zone where you feel like you can't cope, you can't manage, you feel overwhelmed. If you can keep your stress baseline lower, you're going to manage better those little anxiety moments. That's why the rest thing is so important. but expect anxiety. Don't be panicked by it. I like to talk about acing your anxiety. So 3 things that you need to do. Number 1, anticipate it. It's the A of ACE. Expect anxiety, particularly in this season. Number 2, challenge it. So where you know you're going to have to do something that will probably make you anxious, you don't have to wait until that moment when you absolutely have to do it. Think about, are there little bits of that experience I can do one at a time in the space I've got now running up to maybe September, or that moment when I have to go back, for your teenagers and your kids when they have to go back to school, for when you have to go back to work, or for some of those key landmark moments. Are there things you haven't done for 3 months? These things will trigger a little bit of anxiety for all of us just because we've got used to not doing them. Seeing large groups of people, going into spaces that are slightly busier, going to the supermarket, all these things that used to be every day to us that now will raise our anxiety level a little bit. Can you challenge those things in a moment where you don't have to do it, where it's not too crucial? Where if, like I did the other day, I went to the supermarket and I was so bewildered by the experience of all that choice and all those people and all those different types of flour from a moment when I couldn't get any flour at all, that I basically just wandered around for about 15 minutes and then went home again, having really not bought very much that was very useful. Can you challenge your anxiety in moments like that when it doesn't really matter? And so that you can get better at it, your brain can get used to things. And then the E of ACE is edge forwards. As you challenge your anxiety, you start to grow what you can do. So if you've got teenagers and young people, for example, who are very anxious about going back to school, there may be bits of that experience that you can take them through now. So little things like, when did they last walk to school? When did they last stand outside the school gates and look at the building? These are things that you could do with them, or they could do together, or with their mates in this season before they have to go back to school, that help them to edge forwards towards the thing that they need to accomplish come September. And that way we help our minds get used to the anxiety, get used to this new situation, and do it a little bit at a time. And then number 3 of those 3 emotions, of course, is frustration. And do you know what? I don't have a lot that's new to say about frustration. I am still so frustrated. I hope I'm not the only one who's super crabby still in this season. Remember, when your stress level is high, your tolerance is low. You will be more prickly, more active, more reactive. You will be less good at dealing with the minor frustrations of life. We just need to watch out for that. We need to remember that emotions like anxiety can come out as anger and frustration, particularly in children and teenagers who might not be as good at dealing with the emotional complexity of the moment. We need to give ourselves space. When you know you're at the edge of your capacity to handle what life is throwing at you in that moment, take a break, leave the house, go have a cup of tea. Just do whatever you need to do to get out of the situation before you lose it, if you can. Recognize that this is a season where you might not be dealing with things as well as you normally would, and that's okay. But also, did you know one of the best ways to release your tension and the best ways to deal with frustration is something that has been so lacking in the last 3 months? And it's laughter and fun. And that is my number 3 of the 3 things that we need to do in this season. Just like I talked about 3 months ago, it is about pursuing good things. And particularly in the season, what I want to say to you today is, do you need to rediscover how to have fun? And that sounds like a really weird thing to say, but so many people are saying to me now, it's like I do things that used to be fun and they're just not fun anymore. And like, what's wrong with me? I get people round and it's just exhausting and I don't enjoy it at all and I can't think of anything to say, and the things I used to love to do, I don't get the same buzz from anymore. And some of that, I want to say to you, is the effect of exhaustion. It is the effect of living on high alert. When your brain is scanning the horizon for threats all the time, you know what? Not a whole lot of fun. If you can drop your exhaustion level, if you can drop your stress level, you'll start to get back into a zone where those normal things start to feel more normal, where you can actually relax, you can actually have a laugh again and start to enjoy things. If your brain is in emergency mode, you're not going to find that stuff easy. So where you can do that, you'll find that this fun element of life starts to come back in. And let me just say to you, I think one of the things that we need to do in this moment is just drop the intensity. just for a moment. Maybe if we could just relax and have a bit more fun, that would help. This has been inevitably a very intense season, and I think those of us particularly who have some kind of leadership responsibility, but also if you're just that sort of person, you're very analytical and you like to ask the big questions of life, that's good, but maybe in this season, just drop the intensity a bit. You know, there's so much talk about pivoting, or do we need to change the way we live, or what are we going to take into our new normal? Maybe we just need to boundary ourselves some time where we don't ask those big questions just for a moment, and we just try and remember how to have fun. We take a break from the earnest stuff of life and just try to do the frivolous stuff. Have some laughs. You know, ask yourself, when did you last really, really laugh? You know, not just like a gentle chuckle, but like a real belly laugh until there's tears coming down your cheeks. Maybe that's the stuff that we need to do. Maybe we need to try and rediscover some of those things that are so basic to who we are as human beings and to enjoying life. Things like the connection with people. This season has been brutal on some of your friendships. Maybe you need to rediscover some of those again and go through the awkward, painful stage of reintroducing yourself to those people in those spaces again. Talking to people again, discussing some of the difficulty. Some friendships have been strained because some people dealt with this in different ways to other people. Maybe there's that friend who you thought would always be there for you, and then they vanished for 3 months and you didn't hear from them. Maybe you need to have that conversation and do some of the difficult so you can get beyond it and get back to enjoying those friendships again and let some of it go, find some closure. We need to get back into discovering the outdoors again, going out, doing stuff. I know that some of us did that in lockdown. We did our daily exercise. We went out into nature. We need to not lose some of the good things that we gain there, but we need to do them for different reasons now, just for fun, for release, for recreation, going on holiday, just enjoying the downtime of doing that stuff. We mustn't lose what we gained in lockdown, but we also need to gain the things that we couldn't do there, to have the fun, to go out, to do the things that we now can do that we couldn't do, and to do it without guilt. And I know that one of the difficulties in this season is how do you make decisions about what you do and don't do. But some of us do need to release ourselves to say, actually, yes, right now I can do this, and it's okay that I do. I don't need to feel guilty about doing it. Because doing things that you enjoy is important for your mental well-being, it's important for dropping your stress level, and it's important for preparing you so that you can have the things that you need to manage whatever is coming next. You know, this season has challenged some of our most basic needs as human beings, and whatever the next season brings, we need to refuel, we need to re-energize. 3 months ago, I talked about being kind to other people, but also the need to be kind to yourselves, to hold your own needs and feelings with compassion, to care for yourself, to allow yourself to feel what you're feeling, to allow yourself your most basic human needs like rest, like fun, like enjoyment. And again in this season, that's what we're experiencing. And the strains are different, the challenges may be different as we go back to something that's normal, but our human needs are still the same. So those are my 3 things. Get some rest, connect with yourself, and try and rediscover how to have fun. And we'll try and do this whole new normal thing together, Ali, I guess.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. It'd be great to unpack some things on the basis of some questions that we've had in, some of which you've covered in different ways, but maybe just to kind of get into those a little bit more. And one of the things, one question came in around, you know, we've called today Navigating the New Normal, and one of the questions was around like, this isn't the new normal because next week it will change and then it will change again. And I think as people, we don't, life pretty much stays the same most of the time. Until all this happened 4 months ago, generally, you know, there is quite a lot of predictability. Now we are navigating a lot of the change. I really appreciate those 3 things you said. Is there anything else we can be doing just to cope with the fact that no sooner have we found our footing, it seems to change again? Some people will have just been expecting to go to Spain and they've had to cancel holidays. There's a lot of change coming at us. Is there anything else that we could be doing to handle that?
Yeah, and it's an interesting challenge, isn't it, to how we live our lives. And I think a lot of us like to plan a long way in advance. And it's interesting because I think this season has hit, to some degree, most hard. People like you and I, we're in that in-between space where we have quite a lot of responsibility. So a lot of us will have both children, younger children, and maybe older relatives who we're caring for, or maybe you've got one of those but not the other. We've got a lot of responsibility in workspaces as well. And therefore we're used to having quite a lot of control, and we're used to planning quite a long way in advance. And right now we can't do that. Yeah. And that's hardest for people in our position, therefore, because we feel the responsibility. And what we're going to have to do, I think, is learn to boundary how far ahead we can plan, and to live much more, maybe not in the moment, but in a smaller zone than we're used to living. And so I would say, as much as possible right now to people, the best thing you can do psychologically is try not to think too far ahead. Okay. Because you will drive yourself crazy, because you're going to have to deal with about 6 different versions of what September could look like. Much better just to think about, what are the needs of now? What are the needs of this present moment? So I say to people a lot at the moment, if you could just think in terms of August maybe, I mean, we're nearly August, aren't we? But think about now. What's the best thing you can do for yourself through August? Which is why I've talked so much about taking a rest, thinking about how you can drop your stress level, refuel yourself, build your energy back up. If we have this conversation in a month's time, I will be saying the needs for September might be quite different, but we're not there yet. So we have to deal with things one stage at a time. And I think that's going to be quite a new way of thinking for some of us. It's one of the reasons why teenagers actually, to some degree, are handling this better, because their minds don't think so far in advance. Actually, that adult skill, it's normally a skill, but now maybe is a bit of a hindrance, that doesn't kick in. Even it's the last thing to develop as the adolescent mind matures, and it doesn't actually form until you're right in your early 20s. So our teenagers and young adults are actually often doing that better than we are, because they're able to think much more in a shorter space of time. And so it is some of us who would normally like to plan way in advance who are struggling the most.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Another thing you touched on was around this sort of idea of some of us expected to feel a certain way when we were allowed to do certain things. I really resonated with that. You know, my husband was saying, I thought you'd have been all over this when they began to, you know, I thought you'd be catching up left, right and centre. And yeah, different people have expressed different things around that, whether that's around, I was so looking forward to seeing my friends, and I found I didn't have much to say. There's not much going on to report back. And then even weirdly feeling, rather than energized by seeing people, further tired. Will we go back to normal? Like, will at some point we go back to perhaps being very, social creatures? Or have we been changed? Has the last few months changed us beyond recognition?
I know, it's weird, isn't it? And we find ourselves reacting in ways that feels totally out of character, which is quite alarming in the moment. And I think some of that is stuff that we just need to process. So like, I think when you see a friend who you've maybe not been able to see, so my best friends have been shielding, and I literally didn't see them for 3.5 months. That first meeting, you want to feel joy, but suddenly your brain is that's a moment of recognition of what you lost. And actually you may well have suppressed that for 3 months because you just had to get on with it. So we may find that some of those moments, actually there's some difficult emotion that comes up, and that's awkward. It's not what we really wanted to feel, but we are going to have to find ourselves space to, as I said, process and express that. Some of it's exhaustion. So you want to be the party animal, really enjoying it, but actually your whole brain is just saying, really would just like to lie down for a while. We do probably just need to do that. And try not to worry, try not to be too anxious about the fact that we don't feel ourselves in this moment. Someone said to me the other day, I just don't feel like my normal self. Is that going to come back? And I think it will, but we need to recognise, particularly if you know you are exhausted, try not to worry about that and just give yourself space. And I guess for some of us it might change a little bit. There are some things that might be tweaked, but I think over time, particularly when things get back to normal more, we will find that comes back. But there will be things that take us by surprise. I went on a Saturday to fill my car up with petrol and realised as I was paying that I'd forgotten to put a face mask on. It was the first day that they were a legal requirement. And I just said to the cashier, I said, I'm so sorry, I've just realised that I didn't wear a face. And as I was saying it, I could feel tears coming, and I started to come out my eyes, and I was like, oh my goodness, I'm crying, and I am not a crier. I'm not super expressive, and in that moment, I was like, what is happening to me? What is wrong? She was a bit like, whoa, it's fine. Don't panic. I'm not even cross. But some of us are going to find we're reacting in ways that's unexpected, and what the trick in those moments is not to panic, not to feel guilty, but to be able to hold it and say, why? So in that moment, I think what I was feeling like, yet another thing that I've got to do right, and I've done it wrong, and I didn't even mean to, and I felt so overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And when I stopped and paused and I stood outside by my car and thought, that was weird, why did that happen? Then it felt logical, it felt rational, I understood. But if the risk is if we don't take those moments just to connect with ourselves and think about why, that we will just beat ourselves up or try and beat ourselves even harder to keep going, to keep being a superhero, to keep being some perfect robotic model of what we think we should be, instead of the reality of what we are, which is normal people dealing with a not normal situation.
Yeah. You've mentioned a couple of times then this thing about processing, and even in that moment of you sort of stepping back and going, where were those tears coming from? One of the questions that came in was about how do we process that this has been a season of grief? And you mentioned loss, and you talked about making sure that we process that. And obviously, everything from the very significant loss of a loved one, but there's also been those everyday losses, missing out on seeing a friend's child, be born, or missing out on a significant event or holiday. How do we actually process that? Is it just that we acknowledge it and put it out there in our own space of going, that was hard? Or is there something we can do to actually mourn that? Do we need to mourn that? Or is that being a bit overly dramatic?
And I guess there's two ways of processing anything like that. There's the sort of internal processing that you need to do, and there's an external communal processing space that we do as family or as friends or within the relationship that's affected. And both of those things are important. So internally processing will look different for different people, but it could be something like journaling. It could just be having the headspace, the long walks, the prayer space or the meditation space, or reading or listening, or whatever it is that just helps you think. Maybe even, as I said, some therapeutic space where you can bounce your thoughts back and forth and figure out how this has changed your understanding about yourself or whatever it is. The external and the communal processing space is also important, particularly where what you are dealing with is something that's affected a relationship or a circumstance that's more than just you. And sometimes we can create moments to do that. We can't recreate the moment that was lost, the birth of the child or whatever it was, but we can do a moment now that recognises that loss and that does something. And I think sometimes there is some value in doing that together and saying, do you know what? We lost a grandparent and we couldn't all be at the funeral. We watched it on flipping Zoom, which is just not the same at all. Now we can be together. Can we take a moment? Can we go? Can we light a candle? Can we take a moment of prayer, or can we read something, or can we gather and do something just to mark what happened? And I think those ritual type moments are actually really important for us as human beings. And part of that is the collective sharing of the moment. So I think maybe there's some creativity here and stuff we can do. And obviously you and I are from a church background, so for us those landmark moments of life are spaces that the church can often offer people a structure around which now we're having to find different ways of doing those things. But I think one of the ways that we as churches can help our community is by creating spaces where people can do that.
Yeah. Really, really helpful stuff. And I think, you mentioned about, how your best friends were shielding. Another question, probably our last question, I guess, would be around, in normal life, back in sort of February, March time, we would say that friendships were absolutely essential to life, to well-being, to happiness, to joy, close, committed friendships. As a church here at Soul Survival Watford, we're always talking about that, about committed friendships. And then suddenly, all of that was severed, like overnight. The way that we would find joy and rest and fun and those moments of belly laughter that you talked about, all of that changed and we were cut off. Zoom was a poor substitute. It's happened again. I'm always forgetting words now. And then, so what? How? how now going forward, and more of us now can see each other, but that has also been a massive shift and a massive maybe recognition that was a source of strength that we couldn't pull on.
Yeah, and again, there's so many levels there, isn't there? There's a processing of just what does that mean? Like you say, there will be people who you maybe depended on normally, who suddenly you couldn't see. And we were pulled back into our own households, which is kind of weird, because most of us have friends who are as close as family, or maybe even closer, not necessarily than the people we live with. If you live on your own in particular, and you were suddenly pulled back into your own space and you lost the people who were your main support, what does that mean? Do you allow yourself to depend upon those relationships again? And I think we're going to need some time and space to develop and to think and make those decisions around that, and to talk and process that in the different friendship spaces. Some friendships have weathered really well this season, and I mean, some people have done amazingly well on Zoom, or and some of that's down to personality. I'll be honest, I'm rubbish. I'm a real introvert. People think the introverts do this better. I was absolutely rubbish through lockdown because I hate, if I have a friendship, it's really close, and the idea of doing it in that superficial, awful way online, I'd rather not do it at all. Now, if we hit another season where we might have another season of lockdown, or maybe I'm going to have to do that better the second time. And so for me, there's some reflection around how did I react and respond? How might I do that differently? And in some of my friendships, how are we going to plan for that? Do we need to talk about that? I'm aware that for some people, if what happened is that some people disappeared or they lost that contact completely, there might be some processing to do there. So it's tough. I mean, in our 21st century world, we know friendship is one of the things that people struggle with most. Today is International Day of Friendship. But did you know that 1 in 10 people say that they have no close friends at all? Right. Actually, we're not talking in lockdown. In normal circumstances, 1 in 10 people would say they have no one they could turn to in a time of distress or difficulty or crisis. So if some of us are in that space anyway, and then we're all pushed into a season where we become more isolated, where it's like, sometimes as a psychologist, I get people to draw friendship diagrams where you draw and you depict all of your friendships on a piece of paper. But in lockdown, it's like all of our friendships became narrowed and shrunken into this little tiny space in the middle. The pressure on those relationships became really strong. So some of those have struggled with the pressure they were under. And some of the ones on the outside, frankly, as you say, we've forgotten even how to talk to, or we've not seen them for so long. Are they still there? Yeah. Maybe we need to find out. And I think in this moment, there's some deliberate decisions that we need to make about how we do friendship.
Yeah.
But it's not easy.
No, but that is brilliant stuff. Go over just tell me your 3 points again about how we cope with this navigating the new normal.
So we need to get some rest, which involves probably stop doing whatever it is that's been the most demand on you, which I know is going to be difficult, but you need to do it. And then the second thing is reconnecting with yourself. Yeah. What are you feeling in this moment? What have you gone through? What has this meant for you? And giving yourself space to process and express it. And then 3, rediscovering how to have fun. That's really important. Yeah. One last thing that I would say that a lot of people are asking me about, just because we haven't mentioned it, is how on earth do I make decisions about risk in this moment?
Yes, do it.
I think this is brilliant. Just where somebody asked me the other day, like I've got elderly relatives who want to come and visit, but my kids have been back in school, they're seeing friends, my mum is vulnerable, do I let her come to the house, can she hug my daughter? These are such difficult decisions. We as a family have faced them, you all have faced them, everybody is facing them. And there are no right answers, that's probably what makes it difficult. We all have to make a decision based on our perception and understanding both of the risk of the people involved, but also the risk of our context. Yeah. So that might be like, what's the level of virus like in your area right now, or in the spaces that you're circulating? What's the level of risk? So some of us, what we need to do is actually do some fact finding, have a conversation with your doctor maybe about what actually is my level of risk right now. If you have been shielding, you're about to come out of shielding now, and you're like, what does this mean? Because there is still virus everywhere, so I can't just go back to normal life, or can I? there you need to get a good opinion from a doctor and say, you know, just how bad is my risk? We understand the level of risk medically a lot better now than we did 3 months ago. So hopefully you'll get some better guidance from your doctors about that. And then the most important thing I would say psychologically is try and separate those two things, the understanding of the risk from the making of the decision. So even if you can schedule as a family or with your spouse or with a friend or with whoever it is that you get the best advice from or who helps you think clearly, separate two separate conversations. The first one is to try and understand the risk, and you're going to write down as many of the facts as you can, like all the things I've just talked about. And then at another day, another date, maybe even a week later, you're going to sit down and try and make the decision. And the reason that's important is to take the pressure of decision making off you in the moment that you're trying to understand the risk. Because otherwise, you're trying to process some quite complex things and your brain is freaking out. And remember that one of the impact of raised anxiety is you can't process as well. You can't problem solve as well. You can't analyze as well. You cannot think clearly. And that just makes you more panicked because you have to make a decision and you don't know what to do. So try and separate the two things, and it will help you think clearly and try and understand what your risk is. And then later sit down and think, okay, in light of these things that I found out a week ago or yesterday, if you've not got so much time, what's the decision that I feel like I can make? And if you can create space to have those two conversations, those 2 moments of headspace, then whatever decision you make, you can go into it feeling like I did do that well. I wasn't on the fly. I wasn't, my son's favorite phrase of lockdown was panic spamming. Have you heard about panic spamming? He's a big gamer. Panic spamming is when you don't know how to play a game properly, like I don't know how to play any of his games. So you just hit keys at random and hope that your character does something amazing and wins the game, which apparently is what I do all the time. And a lot of us, that's what we're doing in the new normal. We are totally panic spamming our way through it. We don't know what we're doing. And we're very aware, and that feels uncomfortable. Feels like these are huge decisions, but we haven't had time to make them properly. So if you can stop, do that well, you will feel better about the decision you've made. But most important is whatever comes next, you need to know that you did make the decision as well as you could possibly make it in the moment. Recognize there aren't simple answers here. You just need to make the decision as well as you can.
And when you talk about looking at the risk and then making the decisions, a lot of the risk that we've been talking about, that's generally been around us, has been obviously around physical risk, you know, and containing the virus, stay at home and then stay alert. But one of the things it would just be great to quickly draw out is then how much do we play now into the risk to our mental health?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so for some people, for example, let's say now the gyms have opened, going back to the gym, which, you know, presumably there is obviously a further risk of contracting the virus, depending on whether you were staying at home, you know, versus staying at home. But then for some people, their decision to do that will be based on, but my mental health needs this.
Absolutely.
And we could play that out in dozens of different scenarios. Is there a validity in increasing physical risk, but to the benefit of mental health?
Yeah,
risk?
I think we're all playing scales games here with different types of risk and which things matter the most. And depending on your level of physical vulnerability, your decisions about other things will be different. So for me, I have an 8-year-old son, for example, and as we got towards the end of lockdown, I was very, very aware of the impact I was watching daily of lockdown on his development, his psychological well-being, his friendships, his relationships, his emotions, all sorts of things. So the minute he was able to get out and reconnect with friends, he was out, because I also know his physical vulnerability is very low. So for me, that risk of emotional well-being and developmental and social well-being was much, much stronger. But for some people that will be different, or those two things will be much more tricky, and that's where you've got to make your own individual decision. And I think what we have to do as well, as much as we can, and it's really hard because none of us are making these decisions in a vacuum, are we? We've got to try and respect the decisions other people are making. Yeah. So you may look in on someone else and think, well, that's madness. Why are they doing that? Or why aren't they doing that? But actually what we've got to do is respect that people are going to make different decisions based on their different understanding and how they are finding things. Some things matter more to other people than others. Yeah. The ability to hug a grandchild, the ability to go out and have a coffee or go out for dinner, it might not be so important to you, but for other people this is what makes life worth living. So we're all making these decisions. It's not that there's a right answer and a wrong answer. We've all got to just do what's best for us and try and support each other in doing that. But it's difficult.
Yeah. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant stuff. Thank you so much. And I love just that idea of let's just for now concentrate on August and then we can maybe talk again in the autumn. Thank you so much for joining us, Kate, first of all, for joining us tonight. Thank you to everyone that has joined us online. Just to say that you would be so welcome. You probably know this, we're a church, Soul Survivor Watford, and you can join us on any of our live streams. They happen every Sunday at 10:30, and we would love to have you join us in that way. It's been brilliant to share this last hour or so with you. Depending on how things go in the autumn, we may well find that we ask Kate to join us again. But until then, stay safe and hope to see you at some point in person again. Bye.